Every government on earth tells you the same story about money. They say it represents value. They say it is backed by the strength of the economy, by the productivity of workers, by the ingenuity of industry. They hand you a bill with a dead president's face and ask you to trust it completely. But here's what they never tell you. There was once a government that did not ask for your trust. It did not need it. For 700 years, it handed you a coin, and that coin was the proof. You could weigh it. You could bite it. You could melt it down, and the gold was always there, always pure, always exactly what it claimed to be. That government was the Byzantine Empire. That coin was the solidus. And the moment that empire decided to start lying about what was inside it, the greatest military power in the medieval world collapsed within 40 years. The story you were taught goes like this. The Byzantine Empire fell because of the Crusaders, or the Seljuk Turks, or because of political corruption, or because of palace intrigue and weak emperors. Those things existed, but they were the symptoms. The disease started in the treasury. It started when one emperor, facing debts he could not pay, shaved a small, almost invisible percentage of gold from his own coins and hoped no one would notice. Someone always notices. The merchants noticed first, then the foreign traders. Then the armies stopped getting paid in real gold and started getting paid in promises dressed up as gold. And then, when the Seljuk Turks arrived at the plains of Manzikert in 1071 CE, the Byzantine army collapsed in a single afternoon. Not because the soldiers lacked courage, because the financial architecture that funded, fed, and equipped that army had been quietly rotting from the inside for 35 years. You're living through a version of this story right now. The numbers are different, the geography is different, the faces on the coins have changed, but the sequence is identical, and the documentation to prove it exists in university archives, in IMF reports, in numismatic studies at Dumbarton Oaks, and in the fiscal papyri that survived the fall of Constantinople itself. Welcome to Histonix Drift. Behind every headline in your history book, there's a ledger they kept hidden. We open it. This is not a story about ancient coins in a museum. This is a story about the architecture of trust, who builds it, who engineers its destruction, and why the system your savings, your pension, your government's debt, and your currency exist inside. Today is following a documented historical sequence that has only ever ended one way. Stay with this, because by the end you will understand something about money that most economists will never tell you. Not because they do not know it, but because the knowing of it changes everything. In 312 CE, the Roman Empire was broke, fractured, and bleeding. 3 centuries of military overextension, political chaos, and currency debasement had turned the Roman denarius into what historians now call worthless bronze washed in silver. Merchants across the Mediterranean were refusing it. Trade was collapsing. The empire's ability to pay its armies, its bureaucrats, and its suppliers was disintegrating in real time. Constantine. I did not write a speech about this. He did not form a committee. He minted a coin. The solidus, named from the Latin solidus, meaning solid, whole, complete, it weighed 4.55 grams. It contained 24 carats of gold. And from the moment it entered circulation, it was never supposed to change. Not the weight, not the purity, not the design philosophy. The solidus was not currency in the way you understand currency today. It was a constitutional document made of metal. Philip Grierson's landmark 1982 study, Byzantine Coins, published by Dumbarton Oaks, physically examined more than 2,400 coin specimens and ran metallurgical analysis on their gold content across a span of 6 centuries. What he found was extraordinary. From Constantine I through the reign of Nikephoros II, focus in the 960s CE, the gold content of the solidus held at or near 24 carats. 26 emperors, 6 centuries, wars, plagues, famines, invasions, civil conflicts, and palace coups. The coin did not move. This was not piety. This was not tradition for tradition's sake. This was engineered leverage over the known world. To understand what the Byzantines were doing, you need to understand what a reserve currency actually is. A reserve currency is not simply money that other people accept. It is money that other people need. It is money so stable, so predictable, so structurally reliable that foreign governments, foreign merchants, and foreign armies denominate their own contracts in it. They hold it in their treasuries not to spend it, but to use it as a measuring stick for everything else. The solidus became that measuring stick. Alan Harvey's 1989 study, Economic Expansion, in the Byzantine Empire, using Venetian trade documents and Byzantine court records called Practica, traced the solidus's reach from Britain in the northwest to China along the Silk Road in the east. Arab merchants in Baghdad accepted it. Viking traders in Scandinavia hoarded it. Indian spice merchants priced shipments in it. The Byzantine Empire, which occupied a geographic territory roughly the size of modern Turkey and Greece at its peak, exercised financial leverage over an area 20 times that size, not through military conquest, but through monetary credibility. Michael Hendy's 1985, Cambridge studies in the Byzantine monetary economy reconstructed the Byzantine state budget using surviving imperial decrees called chrysobulls and administrative papyri from provincial Egypt. What emerges from this reconstruction is a picture of deliberate fiscal architecture. The Treasury Department, called the Logothesian tu Genikou, maintained gold reserves through a system of provincial taxation designed around a single principle. The empire spent gold only when it collected gold. The bureaucracy tracked inflows and outflows. It maintained what modern economists would recognize as a structural fiscal constraint. The empire could not print its way out of a budget deficit. It could only tax, conquer, or cut. This constraint was not a weakness. It was the source of the solidus's power. When you hold a currency that cannot be inflated, you hold something that no government decision can devalue. The merchant in Alexandria pricing a grain shipment in Solidate knew that the coin he received in 800 CE would buy the same weight of gold as the coin minted in 400 CE. That certainty was the product, not the gold itself. The gold was just the physical enforcement of that certainty. Constantinople became the extraction point for global commerce. Every significant trade route between Europe and Asia passed through or priced itself against Byzantine economic infrastructure. The empire sat at the bottleneck of the medieval world, and it controlled the unit of account that made international trade legible. Taxes flowed in from across the Mediterranean basin. Tribute arrived from neighboring kingdoms. Merchants paid tariffs at Constantinople's Golden Horn Harbor just to access markets denominated in solidi. The empire did not grow wealthy by trading. It grew wealthy by being the infrastructure through which everyone else traded. This is the distinction that textbooks miss. Wealth is what you accumulate. Power is the system that generates wealth without you having to fight for it every time. The Byzantine solidus was not wealth. It was the machinery that concentrated wealth toward Constantinople automatically, structurally, year after year, century after century, because the entire world needed to transact in it. Sound familiar? It should, because this exact architecture, reserve currency status as geopolitical leverage, financial infrastructure as extraction mechanism, the bottleneck position in global trade was rebuilt from scratch by the United States in 1944 at Bretton Woods. The faces changed, the metal changed, the mechanism is identical. In 1042 CE, Constantine IX Monomachos became emperor of Byzantium. He inherited an empire that was, on the surface, still functioning. The borders held, the trade routes ran. Constantinople remained the wealthiest city on earth. But under the surface, the treasury was under pressure that had been building for decades. Military spending had expanded. The empire faced threats on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The Normans in the west, the Pechenegs in the north, and the rising Seljuk Turks pressing from the east. The old system of provincial soldier farmers called the thematic system, which had supplied armies cheaply by giving soldiers land in exchange for military service, had been systematically dismantled by previous emperors who preferred professional mercenaries. Mercenaries cost gold, real gold. Every campaign, every garrison, every supply chain demanded payment in solidi. Constantine IX faced a gap between what the empire collected and what it needed to spend. His answer was the same answer every government reaches when it faces this gap. He debased the currency. The debasement did not happen overnight. It was engineered to be invisible. Angeliki Laiou and Cecile Morrison's 2007 Cambridge study, The Byzantine Economy, cross-referenced numismatic evidence with administrative documents and traced the precise timeline of what happened. Constantine IX began reducing the gold content of the numisma, the standard gold coin, by fractions so small they required specialist assay tools to detect. A coin that had been 24 carats became 22 carats, then 20, then 18. Over time, the reduction accelerated as each emperor inherited both the debt and the habit of the previous one. The physical coins from this period, which Grierson's metallurgical analysis documented in detail, tell the story with precision that no administrative record can fake. You can hold a solidus minted in 950 CE and a numisma minted in 1070 CE and measure the difference. The color shifts. The weight distribution changes. The gold content that had held for 6 centuries collapses across a span of 35 years into coins that are closer to electrum, a gold-silver alloy, than to the pure gold. That had made the Byzantine currency the anchor of medieval global trade. Here is the sequence, as the documentation records it. First, the reduction is invisible to ordinary commerce. Merchants and farmers transact daily in coins they cannot assay. The empire benefits from the difference between the coin's face value and its actual gold content. This is called seigniorage, and it is, in functional terms, a hidden tax on everyone holding the currency. Second, the sophisticated actors notice. International merchants, particularly the Venetians and Genoese who traded across multiple currency systems and could compare the old coins to the new ones, began demanding more numismata per transaction. They priced in the debasement before the Byzantine government acknowledged it. This is the moment the reserve currency premium begins to erode. Foreign traders stop holding Byzantine currency as a store of value and start converting it immediately into goods or into other currencies. Third, the government accelerates the debasement to compensate for declining revenue. Because the international premium is shrinking, the empire collects less real purchasing power per coin than it used to. To maintain spending, it mints more coins. Each additional coin is slightly worse than the last. The feedback loop is now self-reinforcing. Fourth, the military discovers the problem in the worst possible way. By the 1060s, Byzantine mercenary armies were being paid in debased numismata. The mercenaries, many of whom were Normans, Varangians, and Frankish soldiers who moved between employers across multiple kingdoms, understood currency values better than the Byzantine bureaucrats who paid them. They discounted the numisma against what they knew it was worth. They demanded higher nominal payments to compensate. When the empire could not always meet those demands, the mercenaries became unreliable, their loyalty contingent on immediate payment rather than institutional trust. In 1071 CE, at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, the Byzantine army under Emperor Romanos fought. Diogenes met the Seljuk forces of Alp Arslan. What followed was not primarily a military failure. The Byzantine army had numerical advantages and positional options. What it lacked was cohesion. The mercenary contingents behaved as mercenaries paid in questionable currency behave. They withdrew at critical moments. Command structures built on financial loyalty dissolved when the financial foundation cracked. The battle lasted one afternoon. The emperor was captured. The Anatolian heartland, which had provided the agricultural base and the military recruitment pool for the empire's armies for 4 centuries, was permanently lost. 35 years of invisible debasement produced a single afternoon of catastrophic military collapse. The documentation connecting those two facts, the coin essays, the treasury records, the trade documents, the military pay disputes, exists in the archives. Liu and Morrison assembled it. Hendy quantified it. Grierson's metallurgy confirmed it. The pattern is not a theory. It is a sequence. Now you need to confront the question that the title of this video raised and that most financial history refuses to answer directly. If every government is in debt, who is the creditor? The Byzantine answer to this question illuminates something that modern financial commentary almost universally avoids. Debt is not a relationship between a borrower and a lender in the way personal debt works. At the sovereign level, debt is a relationship between a currency issuer and the holders of that currency. When the Byzantine Empire debased its coins, it was not failing to repay a loan. It was defaulting on a promise made to every single person on earth who held a solidus. The creditors were not a specific bank or a specific nation. The creditors were the entire global merchant class that had organized their commerce around Byzantine monetary credibility. This is the first answer to the question. The creditor is the system of trust itself, and the Byzantine collapse demonstrates what happens when a sovereign decides to extract from that trust rather than maintain it. But there is a second, more structural answer that the historical record provides. When the Byzantine numisma began to fail as a reserve currency, something had to replace it. The vacuum in international monetary architecture is never empty for long. By the time the Byzantine debasement was accelerating in the mid-11th century, 2 entities were already positioning themselves to become the next gatekeepers of European commercial credit, Venice and Genoa. Both city-states had been granted extraordinary trade privileges by the Byzantine Empire in exchange for naval support, privileges documented in the Chrysobull of 1082 CE issued by Alexios I Komnenos to Venice. The Venetians received exemption from all Byzantine customs duties across the entire empire in exchange for a fleet. The empire traded its financial infrastructure access for short-term military capacity. It surrendered the bottleneck it had held for 7 centuries to pay a bill it could not afford in gold. Venice then used those trading privileges to build exactly the kind of monetary architecture the Byzantines had pioneered. The Venetian ducat, introduced in 1284 CE, was a gold coin of precisely defined weight and purity modeled consciously on the solidus's design philosophy. It became the new reserve currency of Mediterranean trade. The creditor relationship shifted from Constantinople to the Rialto. The extraction mechanism did not disappear. It relocated. This is the structural truth that every reserve currency transition in history demonstrates. When one currency loses its anchor position, the value does not evaporate. It flows to whoever has built the next credible system. The creditor is always whoever controls the next unit of account. In the modern context, this question becomes immediately relevant to your life. The IMF's 2023 World Economic Outlook documents the US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves declining from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2023. This is not a dramatic crash. It is a slow erosion of exactly the kind that preceded the Byzantine debasement's visible phase. The dollar's reserve share is not collapsing. It is receding. And the entities positioning themselves to capture what recedes include the Chinese renminbi, gold-backed bilateral trade agreements between BRICS nations, and, in a newer development, sovereign digital currency systems that several central banks are currently building. The question of who becomes the next creditor is the most consequential geopolitical question of the next 50 years. And the Byzantine record tells you that the answer will not be announced. It will be discovered after the fact in the new prices of old goods. After Manzikert, the Comnenian dynasty that took over the Byzantine Empire in 1081 CE faced the same problem that every post-crisis government faces. The old currency was broken. The international community had lost confidence in the numisma. Something new was needed, not new in substance, but new in signal. Alexios I Komnenos introduced the Hyperpyron in 1092 CE. The name means highly refined in Greek. It was a gold coin of restored purity, a deliberate signal to international markets that the Byzantine state was recommitting to monetary discipline. And for a period, it worked. The Hyperpyron stabilized Byzantine monetary credibility sufficiently to enable the Comnenian dynasty's economic recovery documented by Harvey's 1989 study, which shows expanding trade volumes and restored Silk Road commerce through the 12th century. But the Hyperpyron also carried a structural weakness from birth. The empire that issued it was no longer the empire that had issued the solidus. The Anatolian heartland was gone. The provincial tax base was permanently reduced. The thematic military system could not be rebuilt because the land that had supported it was under Seljuk control. The Comnenian emperors funded the Hyperpyron's gold purity through an increasingly narrow tax base and through selling trade access to the Venetians and Genoese, exactly the kind of structural erosion that looks like stability from the outside, while the foundations hollow out. By the 13th century, the Hyperpyron itself began to debase. The cycle repeated. And in 1204, the Fourth Crusade, financed in part by Venetian capital and directed in part by Venetian commercial interests, sacked Constantinople itself. The city that had been the creditor of the medieval world was looted by the creditors it had created. The parallel to the modern dollar system is documented, not speculative. In 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods system under which the dollar was convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Like Constantine IX's first debasement, this was presented as a temporary technical adjustment. Nixon called it a temporary suspension. The suspension became permanent. The dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed not by a physical commodity, but by confidence in U.S. institutional credibility, military power, and economic size. For the first 2 decades, the system held and even expanded. The petrodollar arrangement, formalized through U.S.-Saudi agreements in 1974, ensured that global oil trade was denominated in dollars, creating structural demand for dollar reserves across every oil-importing nation on Earth. This was the dollar system's version of the solidus's Silk Road reach. The bottleneck shifted from a trade route to a commodity. Every nation that needed oil needed dollars. Every nation that needed dollars held U.S. Treasury bonds. The United States became the issuer of the world's reserve account and spent that privilege for 50 years. The IMF data on reserve currency share tells the debasement story in modern numbers. The dollar's 71% share in 1999 falling to 58% in 2023 represents the same slow, initially invisible erosion that Grierson's metallurgical analysis documents in Byzantine coins from the 1042-1071 period. The physical coins from that era do not show dramatic collapse. They show gradual reduction, coin by coin, year by year, each one slightly less than the last. The modern equivalent of the Byzantine merchant class noticing the debasement first is visible in the BRICS nations' push for non-dollar trade settlement. In 2023, Saudi Arabia began accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases, the first significant crack in the petrodollar bottleneck since its construction. Russia and China have expanded bilateral trade in their own currencies. India and the UAE have settled trades in rupees. None of these transactions are large enough individually to threaten dollar dominance. Collectively, they are the 1042 debasement. Small, incremental, structurally significant. The Hyperpyron moment for the dollar has not arrived yet, but the historical sequence suggests it will. The question the Byzantine record forces you to ask is not whether the transition happens. It is who builds the next unit of account, who captures the creditor position, and how long the transition takes before it becomes visible in the prices you pay for everything. The most important lesson the Byzantine monetary collapse teaches is not about the currency that failed. It is about the entities that positioned themselves before the failure became obvious. Venice did not become the dominant commercial power of the medieval Mediterranean by accident. The Venetians had spent 2 centuries embedded in Byzantine commercial infrastructure, learning its systems, building relationships with its merchant networks, and accumulating the institutional knowledge needed to operate a reserve currency system. When the Byzantine numisma began to fail, Venice did not scramble to respond. It executed a plan it had been building for generations. The Chryso Bull of 1082 CE, which gave Venice its customs exemptions, is the documentary record of this transition in progress. Alexios Thurstor Komnenos thought he was buying naval power. He was selling his monetary architecture's gatekeeping function to the entity that would replace it. The Venetians understood the transaction better than the emperor did. Today, the entities positioning themselves ahead of a potential reserve currency transition are identifiable, documented, and operating in public view if you know where to look. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, has allocated over $1 trillion in infrastructure financing across more than 140 countries. The surface narrative is infrastructure development. The structural function is the construction of trade routes, ports, rail lines, and energy pipelines denominated in or connected to Chinese financial systems. This is the extraction of bottleneck positions across the developing world, before those bottleneck positions become denominated in a Chinese-controlled unit of account. China is building the infrastructure layer first, exactly as Venice embedded itself in Byzantine trade networks before introducing the ducat. The gold accumulation patterns of central banks outside the Western financial system tell a parallel story. In 2022 and 2023, central banks globally purchased gold at rates not seen since 1967, with China, Russia, India, Turkey, and several Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds representing the bulk of purchases, according to World Gold Council data. Nations that hold large gold reserves retain the option to anchor a currency to a commodity if the fiat system experiences a confidence crisis. They are purchasing optionality. The Byzantine solidus' 7th century stability was built on exactly this logic. The digital currency infrastructure represents the third positioning strategy. As of 2024, 134 countries, representing 98% of global GDP, are in various stages of developing central bank digital currencies, according to the Atlantic Council's CBDC tracker. A digital currency system potentially allows its issuer to create the same kind of frictionless, universally accessible monetary infrastructure that the solidus provided, but without the physical constraint of gold supply. The nation or coalition of nations that deploys a credible, internationally accepted digital reserve currency first captures the gatekeeper position for the next monetary era. The Venetian lesson is that this capture does not happen at the moment of crisis. It happens in the decades before the crisis through patient construction of infrastructure, relationships, and institutional credibility. The crisis then reveals who is already in position. You are watching this positioning happen in real time. The IMF's reserve currency data, the World Gold Council's central bank purchase reports, the Atlantic Council's CBDC tracker, and the trade settlement data from BRICS nations are all chapters in the same document that Grierson, Hendy, Harvey, and Liu assembled about Byzantium. The archivists will write the definitive history of this transition in 50 years. The structural moves are happening now. History does not repeat. But the documented sequences of monetary architecture construction, confidence erosion, and reserve currency transition follow patterns consistent enough across centuries that ignoring them is a choice, not a necessity. Here is what the Byzantine record, assembled from Grierson's coin assays, Hendy's treasury reconstructions, Harvey's trade documents, and Liu and Morrison's debasement timeline, actually tells you about the system you are living inside. The first principle is that reserve currency status is a structural position, not a natural condition. The solidus did not dominate global trade for 700 years because Byzantine culture was superior or because God favored Constantinople. It dominated because Constantine I built a system of monetary credibility enforced by physical gold and maintained by institutional fiscal discipline. That system created leverage that compounded across centuries. When the institutional discipline eroded, the leverage eroded with it. The currency followed the institution. The institution followed the fiscal architecture. The fiscal architecture followed the political incentives of the people running it. The second principle is that debasement is always invisible at the start and always catastrophic at the end. The 35 years between Constantine IX's first gold reduction and the Battle of Manzikert felt, to most people living through them, like normal times with occasional problems. The coins still circulated, the market still functioned. Constantinople was still the richest city on earth. The collapse, when it arrived, felt sudden. It was not sudden. It was the accumulated weight of 35 years of small decisions landing on a single afternoon in eastern Anatolia. The third principle is that the creditor position relocates, it does not disappear. The wealth that flows through a reserve currency system does not evaporate when the reserve currency fails. It flows to whoever built the next system. Venice captured Byzantine trade infrastructure and used it to build the medieval world's next monetary architecture. The nation, or coalition, that builds the next credible reserve system captures the extraction position for the next era. The fourth principle is that the transition happens slowly, then suddenly, and the sudden part is indistinguishable from normal volatility until it is over. The Byzantine merchants who noticed the debasement in the 1050s could not have told you that 1071 would be the catastrophic year. They knew something was wrong. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. The adjustment of behavior by enough sophisticated actors was itself part of the mechanism that made the collapse self-fulfilling when the pressure point arrived. For your own financial decisions, the Byzantine record does not prescribe a specific response. It prescribes a specific awareness. The dollar's reserve share is declining at a documented rate. The entities positioning to capture the next reserve position are identifiable. The infrastructure of the next monetary era is under construction now. Gold accumulation by central banks outside the Western system is at 60-year highs. Digital currency systems are being built across 134 nations. Trade settlement in non-dollar currencies is expanding. None of this tells you when the transition reaches its visible phase. The Byzantine record suggests the timing is unpredictable and the structural direction is not. The direction is toward a more multipolar monetary system with reduced dollar dominance and increased competition among reserve currency alternatives. The transition will disadvantage nations, institutions, and individuals whose wealth is denominated in a single reserve currency without diversification. It will advantage those who understand the structural mechanics and position accordingly. The Byzantine Empire lasted for another 4 centuries after Manzikert, but it never recovered the solidus's reserve currency position. The extraction mechanism that had funded its power, the bottleneck position in global trade, the monetary credibility that made every merchant from Britain to China hold Byzantine gold, transferred to Venice and never returned. Constantinople fell in 1453 CE to the Ottoman Empire, but the financial fall happened in 1071. In the 35 years before that, in the ledger of an emperor who thought small debasements were invisible. They were not invisible. They were simply invisible to the people not looking. You are now looking. The 700-year gold standard built by Constantine I, maintained by 26 emperors across 6 centuries, documented in coin assays, treasury papyri, trade records, and imperial decrees, and destroyed by 35 years of fiscal decisions that felt reasonable at the time, is not a story about ancient coins in a museum. It is a blueprint. It is a warning. And depending on who reads it and what they do with the reading, it is also a map. The ledger is open. The question is whether you will read it. This has been Histonix Drift. The sequence is documented. The parallels are real. The next chapter is being written now, and unlike the Byzantine archivists, you do not have to wait 50 years to see it.